I always loved hearing Graham talk about the Adirondacks. She described them with a sparkle in her eyes, as though she was letting me in on a secret. She made the mountains sound alive, like an old friend she missed dearly. So, when she passed, it just felt right to bring her back to the place she loved most. "I need to escape the city," she'd often say with a chuckle. "I belong with my mountains." That summer in mid-July, I packed up her ashes and set out for New York. I knew I'd mourn her loss and think of her fondly, but it was her heart, her spirit. It was her I was bringing back to the mountains. Graham's love for adventure was infectious, and I had inherited that passion for the outdoors. The drive was heavy with the solemn task ahead. The journey began with me setting up base at an old log cabin in Keene Valley. Amidst the rustling leaves and crisp morning air, I realized the weight of my mission, a duty to a beloved grandmother whose memories had colored my existence. Over the next few days, I began my hikes, driving to the trails early in the morning when the mist still clung lazily to the peaks. Every step, rustle, and bird song seemed to match my heartbeat as I ventured deeper into the Adirondacks. As I hiked, memories of Graham's stories washed over me. The towering pines, chirping crickets, and rustling leaves felt like reminders of her, strengthening my spirit and resolve. I spent whole days exploring trails she'd mentioned in her stories, basking in the silence and the solitude that the mountainous expanse granted me. On one hike, I reached a clearing that overlooked a secluded, shimmering lake nestled between the peaks. This was it. This was where Graham had spoken of spreading her ashes, where she felt completely at one with nature. As the sun began to set, I opened the urn. The summer wind, scented with pine and wildflowers, took the ashes and spread them across the lake and into the wilderness. As I watched the last remnants of her earthly existence blend with the elements, my heart throbbed with a vibrant mixture of emotions: loss, love, peace, and a sense of profound fulfillment. I knew then that this is where she had always meant to be, within her beloved mountains, free and unfettered. As I headed back to the cabin, the woods around me felt different. The forest's fresh scent was replaced by a musky, sour smell. There was a shift in the undercurrent of the forest symphony, an unease that prickled my senses. Then I heard it, a piercingly shrill cry that echoed through the mountainous expanse. It wasn't a sound I could attribute to any animal, known or unknown, and it sent a chill running down my spine, turning the beautiful landscape to something eerie and foreboding. In the silence that followed, I stood rooted to the spot. My breath hitched. I felt watched, a sensation that had me spinning around attempting to pierce the twilight gloom. But all I saw were shadows lengthening under the moonlit sky. All I heard was my heartbeat crashing against my ribcage. My breath turned frosty in the night air, and a deep unease settled. I felt I wasn't alone. Little did I know just how terrifying the evening would turn, and how the memories of this trip would haunt me for the rest of my days. I was about to turn back when something stopped me in my tracks. There in the middle of the path was a deer carcass, partially eaten, rotting and oddly twisted. Its visceral remnants spread around, the off-putting stink of stale death permeating the air. I felt a mix of confusion and instinctual fear. I stared, taken aback by the shocking sight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in the tree line. It towered above me, standing almost 9 feet tall. Its aged, dense antlers stood tall amongst the skeletal frame of what could be described as a head. Its face resembled a weathered deer skull, pale with hollows where eyes should be. But oh, those eyes. They weren't vacant holes. They were alive, glowing with a ghastly yellow light that held an eerie pull. The creature's body was a mix of decayed flesh and skeletal bones. Its nauseating stench made my stomach churn. Fear took over, pushing away all logic. Frozen in place, I stared at the creature standing close by. For a moment, time stood still, and silence prevailed. The creature apparently did not see me, or chose to ignore my existence and moved on, its towering figure disappearing into the dense underbrush. I hurried back to the cabin, the once friendly woods now seeming ominous. Back at the cabin, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Lying on the wooden floor, every noise and shadow consumed me with fear. I looked up at the moonlit sky, thinking of Graham and her love for these forests. It now held a different meaning, a different face, one of horror and dread. Throughout the night, I listened to the haunting cries of what I now believe to be a Wendigo. I thought of Graham and wondered if her spirit had protected me, allowed me to see the creature without being seen. At times, I question its authenticity, find myself questioning the reliability of my own memory. But then, I think about the deep-rooted horror I felt, and the visceral reality of the incident resurfaces. Despite the terror, I found that incident brought me closer to my grandmother, that it forged a stronger bond with the mountains she loved. I wondered if her spirit had confronted the Wendigo, reminding me of nature's dual nature. Now, I live with the memory of my encounter, the haunting cries of the Wendigo, and a deep love for the mountains, a gift from my grandmother. I desperately needed some downtime from my hectic life. I decided to reconnect with nature. I booked a rental for a remote cabin in the Montana forest. The isolation and wilderness were refreshing. I loved the idea of a fireplace and a good book. The cabin was next to a river and surrounded by pines. It was picture perfect. I was alone, but that was the goal. No cell service, barely any electricity, me and my old Labrador Toby. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first few days were uneventful. I spent them exploring the surroundings, hiking and fishing during the day, whiling away the evenings with a book by the fire. Toby loved it too, always eager to snuffle through the underbrush, probably tracking the scent of some rabbit or squirrel. On the fourth night, I sat by the fireplace with an old classic, enjoying the chilly evening. I had made a pot of soup earlier, nice and hearty, full of wild mushrooms I had found earlier that day. Toby lay at my feet, sleeping soundly, or so I thought. Suddenly he growled, clearly sensing something off. I immediately looked up from my book. Toby was an easygoing dog. Apart from squirrels and chipmunks, very few things ruffled him. He was sitting bolt upright now, ears pricked, eyes focused on the cabin's single window. I followed his gaze, squinting to peer out into the blackness. There was only the night and the silhouette of pines against the moonlit sky. Just some nocturnal creature scuttling about, I reasoned. Nothing of concern. I patted my dog consolingly, assuring him there was nothing to worry about, though I was a bit unnerved myself. We went back to our ritual, me trying to focus on the book, Toby still on high alert. About an hour or so later, a strange sort of howl broke the silence. It was unlike anything I'd heard before. It was deep, echoing in the silence of the night. A guttural howl that sent shivers down my spine and turned Toby from alert to truly petrified. He cowered next to me, hackles raised, whining, a far cry from the usually spirited dog. Nervous, I put out the fire and locked the little cabin up tight. Toby and I moved to the upper loft. As I changed into my sleeping clothes, I felt the cabin's vulnerability, sensing the fear practically rolling off of Toby. The howl made my heart race and filled me with dread. I reasoned it might be a wolf, given the location. Comforting my dog, I settled into the cot, reassuring Toby with soft words and gentle strokes. I told myself it was just the sounds of nature. But as sleep eluded me, and I lay awake, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling of distress growing in me. Nor could I ignore the putrid smell that slowly crept in through the wooden walls of the cabin. Rancid, offensive, utterly contaminating. Time seemed to drag on, and just when I thought the night couldn't possibly get worse, the horrific growls started. Far at first, but then closer, outside the cabin. Much, much too close for comfort. The high-pitched cries shattered the silence. It was a sound I couldn't mistake for anything else. The sound of distress. I shot up from the cot, heart pounding in my chest. The sound pitched upward, a scream, then cut off abruptly. The pungent scent in the air turned acrid, condensing fear into something palpable, and all I could think of was someone or something needed help. I mustered my courage, grabbed my torch, and made my way downstairs. Toby on my heels. What I saw from the window was far from what I could have ever anticipated. There it was, towering over 7 feet with broad shoulders, covered in dark coarse fur. The creature was standing on its hind legs, its elongated feet dug into the moist earth. Its facial features were dreadfully uncanny, a manifestation straight out of nightmare fuel. A long snout, sharp as if chiseled, accompanied by a scarred face, skin stretched tight over pronounced brow ridge, and a strong jawline housing long exposed canines. The yellow eyes glinted in the cabin lights, revealing a depth of emotion suggesting its troubles. Stunned, I stood glued at the spot, my breath hitched in my throat. There, outside my cabin, stood the Dogman, a creature I dismissed as local folklore. I saw its chest heave, the huff of its breath visible in the cold night as it growled low, a sound that was deeply unsettling. But there was something else in its eyes, a plea. Torn between fear and confusion, I debated whether to help the creature or flee. Erring on the side of caution, I decided to play it safe. I backed away from the window slowly, making the least amount of noise possible. Toby whimpered as I picked him up, hushed him, and stealthily made our way to the vehicle parked a little way off from the cabin. We drove away from what I had thought was just a mythical creature. Days, weeks, and then months passed after the encounter. My mind often drifted back to that horrifying night, forcing me to face the fact that my retreat wasn't merely an escape from danger, but a denied plea for assistance. Montana's forests, once peaceful for me, now held a sense of unease. The once calming solitude now hinted at hidden creatures. Undeniably, the experience changed my view of the world. Every rustle or snap now suggested the presence of the unknown. The encounter showed me that bravery can be tested by the unknown. I often find myself wondering if the Dogman still roams the Montana woods, or if it has ventured farther. I often wonder how things might have changed had I stayed to help. But then again, some questions are better left unanswered. Got a story that happened high up in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. This was about 6 years ago, around the tail end of summer. It was a bright sunny day, with the mountain peaks shining white, and the air feeling incredibly fresh. The landscape was vast and breathtaking. At that time, wasn't like I was out there seeking thrills. I was looking for some peace. Life was a bit rough back east, so I figured just hit the Rockies on my own. Get lost in the quiet. The mountaintop was silent. The only sounds were the whistling wind and the crunch of my footsteps. So, I started my hike early. Packed light, just a bag of trail mix, water, and a map I'd studied the night before. I followed the well-worn trails at first, watching marmots scurry along the rocks, listening to the distant call of eagles. But soon, my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself wandering off the established trails. As I hiked, a feeling of peacefulness settled over me. I enjoyed the hard climb, the slight burn in my legs, the feeling of the cool wind hitting my face. From time to time, I'd stop to drink water, take in the majestic landscape unfolding around me. I think it was on one of these breaks when I first noticed it, the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. This felt different. The silence was unsettling. It was then that I realized something. The sounds of nature, the calls of the birds, the rustling of the leaves, all were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. That's when I felt a creeping sensation at the back of my neck. I had this eerie feeling of being watched. Despite being in a bright, open area, I couldn't shake off a nagging sensation of unease. I'm a guy who thrives on solitude. I usually relish being alone in wild places, but in that moment it felt wrong. Trying to shake it off, I thought maybe I'd been hiking alone for too long, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the uncomfortable silence and the feeling of being watched continued to linger. And that's when I heard the first sound, a knock. It was distant but distinct against the backdrop of silence. I paused, thinking maybe it was a woodpecker somewhere. But then I heard it again, the same knock, this time a little louder, a little more urgent. That's when I noticed the smell. an acrid odor like spoiled meat combined with a damp, musty scent. I quickly covered my nose, trying not to gag. I had never encountered that smell before. It felt as out of place as I did. In a state of heightened alertness, I continued climbing, deciding to reach a higher vantage point. I made my way to a nearby ridge, hoping to spot something, someone, anything that would explain the unsettling feeling plaguing me. And that's when I saw it, or rather saw the signs of it. A large, powerful, vague silhouette moving swiftly through the woods down below. A rush of fear hit me, almost overshadowing the view. The creature was enormous, far beyond what I had expected. As I stood there stunned, I realized I was dealing with something far beyond what I had ever imagined. After that discovery, my journey felt surreal. I'm a reasonable guy, and I don't take the unexplained lightly. But there I was, lost on a mountainside in Colorado, with an unbelievably colossal, hulking silhouette, disappearing into the wilderness. The putrid smell was inescapable. I tried to think rationally, searching for a logical explanation. I noticed that the creature left behind a trail. Despite my apprehension, I couldn't help but follow the trail out of sheer curiosity. So, I decided to investigate further. I found prints, unnatural prints. They were gargantuan, massive. I have never seen any like it. They didn't match any known animal in these parts. I couldn't make sense of what was before me. All the while, the silence remained. The only signs grounding me to reality were a distant knock and the pungent smell in the air. It was deeply unsettling, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, a deep resonating growl echoed through the trees. Its growl was so deep that I felt it reverberate in the air around me. A chill ran down my spine, and that's when I saw it. A massive figure stood near a tree not far from me. I locked eyes with it, or what seemed to be eyes. Its face was shadowed, with deep-set eyes under a heavy brow, giving it an intense, brooding expression. The creature was covered head to toe in brownish-red hair, gleaming in the sun like hammered bronze. It let out a deep grunt. Our eyes locked onto each other. I was consumed with fear, yet oddly fascinated. Once the shock subsided, I cautiously retreated. It watched, its massive figure towering over the landscape, but noticeably non-aggressive. Before I knew it, the Sasquatch was bounding off effortlessly up the mountain, with a powerful grace that contradicted its monstrous physique. It vanished, leaving behind a few tracks in the quiet. I quickly retreated to my campsite. The tranquility of my hike shattered. I spent a restless night, barely sleeping. I'd frequently awaken to my heart racing, met with the stillness of the night and the moonlit mountainside. After a restless night, I decided first thing in the morning to cut my trip short. On my return, I shared the tale sparingly, not knowing how people might react or what they might think of me. After all, who would believe a solitary hiker claiming to have locked eyes with a Sasquatch? Over time, my fear faded, replaced by a sense of wonder and luck for having witnessed something so elusive. There are countless mysteries hidden away in the natural world. The Rockies hold secrets beyond their scenic trails. So, to anyone planning to take the same hike, tread lightly, stay aware, and remember, you're not the only one in the woods. A few years ago, I found myself at one of the most hauntingly beautiful locations on Earth, Point Reyes National Seashore, California. The time was early morning, but the sun was nowhere to be seen. A thick fog had rolled in from the sea, covering the sunlight and spreading a ghostly shade over the landscape. When I arrived, the thick fog muffled sounds, giving a surreal stillness to everything around me. It was eerie, yet invigorating. A landscape shrouded in fog is incredibly humbling. It reminds you of your small place in the enormity of nature. My job involves traveling to beautiful places to capture their essence. There I was, in the fog, camera in hand. In the quiet, I felt inspired not just to document the scene, but to try to capture the lighthouse's isolated mystery in this fog that heightened my senses. The climb to the lighthouse comprised 308 steps. descending the equivalent of 30 stories. The lighthouse seemed even smaller against the vast backdrop of sea and fog. I adjusted my camera gear and began my descent. Each click of my camera seemed to get lost in the dense, quiet fog. I took shots from various angles, captivated by the lighthouse's defiance against the elements. I aimed to contrast the sturdy, man-made lighthouse with the engulfing, unpredictable fog. Perhaps it was the fog or the deep silence, but I sensed an odd energy, a kind of charge in the air that drew me further into the unknown. Every so often, shapes would form in the fog, spectral outlines that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. I wrote it off as the imaginings of an overtaxed mind, trying to impose recognizable shapes on the vast swathes of foggy emptiness. It must have been the deceptive serenity of the place that made me want to whisper, not to disturb the engulfing silence. I was slowly losing track of time, and for a moment there, I felt like the sole witness of a world between the realms of reality and dream. Capturing this scene felt like photographing a grayscale painting, with the lighthouse as a beacon amid the haze. The silence continued, dominating the scene, but it wouldn't last, and that's when I saw it emerge from the dense sheet of white, unlike anything I'd ever witnessed before. Large, almost human-like, but oh, so different in its bearing. They call it the Mothman, I promise. It was as real as the fog it emerged from. It took shape from a mere shadow, its form subtly flickering as though struggling to materialize fully. It seemed as if the fog itself was giving substance to its shadowy form. Its eyes were a fiery red, casting an eerie glow that penetrated the thick fog. No discernible mouth, no visible nose, just those massive red eyes, reflecting a keen intelligence that struck fear into my heart. Attached to a body that, though human-like in its rough form, was smoky gray and alarmingly broad. Leather wings unfolding the fog around it. The majesty and terror of it, perched atop the lighthouse, was almost hypnotic. My hand, involuntarily, brought up my camera, as if trying to cope with the strange reality by capturing it. As the lens focused onto it, the creature spoke. Its voice was like a distant ocean rumble, somehow part of the fog yet chillingly distinct. Beware the mirror when the moon is lost. Then, just as it appeared, it vanished back into the fog, leaving behind those haunting words echoing in my ears and a few digital imprints on my memory card. The fog grew suffocating, as if trying to fill the void the creature left behind. I lingered around in dreadful anticipation, but the fog never stirred again, nor did the spectral creature return. There was nothing but the monotonous sound of the sea and the eerie loneliness that surrounded the lighthouse. I was left in a state of horror and disbelief, with only the cryptic warning as my keepsake. I continued to document the lighthouse amidst the fog, but the thrill was gone, replaced by an unnamed dread and a mystery far more captivating than the fog-engulfed lighthouse. The encounter with the Mothman sent me on a quest filled with mystery and unease. I started to dig deeper, pry open the tales of folklore that spoke about this creature, and the ominous warnings it is believed to deliver, desperately trying to decipher the strange riddle. Beware the mirror when the moon is lost. I wondered whether it was a cryptic indication of an impending disaster or an alien perception of human reality. But no answers came, only more questions piled up. Days turned into weeks, then months, making the event feel more like a dream. Perhaps that's what an encounter with the unusual does to one's mind, casting doubt, throwing the inherent notion of reality in turmoil. What remains constant is my quest for answers, traveling to fog-laden corners of the world with just my camera. Recalling that day sends chills down my spine, especially when the lines between reality and the uncanny blur. Whenever the moon disappears behind the clouds, unease takes hold of me, a reminder of my encounter and the Mothman's cryptic message. If the creature comes out of the fog again, I hope to be braver, more prepared for the encounter, and whatever calamity its arrival might portend. But for now, all that's left from the strange encounter that day is a haunting memory and an unsolved riddle. Bird watching for many might seem mundane, but for me, it's a form of meditation. The anticipation of spotting a new bird, the quick, cerulean flash of a bluebird darting through foliage, the silent glide of an owl as it cuts through the twilight, all of it thrills me. The vast green expanses of Congaree National Park in South Carolina provide the perfect backdrop. For as long as I can remember, I've dreamed of ticking off a checklist of birds that call this park home. For my birthday, I treated myself to some time off and booked a cabin near the park. I grabbed my binoculars and my birdwatching journal and had set off on my personal expedition. The early morning sun filtered through the foliage, casting shadows around me. I was making a slow, calculated path through the park when I spotted my first rare sight, a yellow-crowned night heron. Capturing a photo, I felt a surge of excitement. I was in my element, hoping the dawn would reveal new species. Perched on a raised embankment, I watched the birds flit by peacefully. A cardinal darted around, a flash of bright red against the backdrop of green and brown. I looked through the viewfinder of my camera, adjusting the aperture to capture a vivid, clear shot of the cardinal as it settled momentarily upon a branch. In my pursuit, I trekked deeper into the park, moving as silent as possible. I found a spot protected by a circling embrace of towering trees, where I set up my binoculars. Sunshine filtered through the canopy, illuminating the moss on the tree bark. I sat on a fallen log, notebook at the ready, binoculars positioned carefully, and I watched and listened. Birdwatching requires attention to sound. You start to learn the symphony of bird calls, each trill or whistle unique. By mid-afternoon, the forest echoed with crows, finches, and the distant sound of a woodpecker. But amidst the familiar, there was the unfamiliar. From afar, there came a strange clicking sound, like a tongue clicking on the roof of a mouth. It was quiet but rhythmic, a sound I hadn't associated with any bird I knew. My curiosity piqued. This could be a new species, a notion that alone was exhilarating. So, I packed up and began to move toward the direction of the sound. As I ventured further, the clicking grew louder. Throughout, I couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. The normally peaceful park somehow felt different, transformed. The cheerful chirping of the birds had fallen noticeably silent as I neared the sound, replaced by an unsettling stillness that laid heavy on the surrounding woods. I arrived at a secluded spot in the shadow of a mammoth oak tree. The clicking was louder here, an eerie rhythm that echoed faintly from a nearby thicket. Squinting against the dusk that was starting to settle, I noticed something moving in the underbrush. In that tense moment between the familiar and the unknown, a deep sense of dread gripped me. Something felt distinctly wrong about this situation. Yet, the possibility of a new species kept me going. Ignoring the growing chill of impending danger, I edged closer, camera at the ready. As I looked through the undergrowth, I saw something unsettling. To my horror, the source of the clicking sounds wasn't a bird at all. Just a few feet away, nestled amongst a tangle of brambles, was a creature. I can't describe how it truly looked. Its body, long and bizarrely lean, was unlike anything I'd ever seen in nature. Its skin was pale, almost skeletal. But what unsettled me the most was how human-like it appeared. Unlike the usual four-legged inhabitants of the park, this creature was on all fours, its bony arms and legs arranged in a grotesque adaptation of a crawl. Then I saw its face, where a mouth should have been gaped a large, dark hole, and in the twilight, something indistinguishable seemed to click inside. Its eyes bore into me, two large, lifeless black orbs that chilled me to my very core. And then, in an abrupt, horrifying movement, the creature took off. Too shell-shocked to react, I could only watch as it swiftly climbed up a tree. It moved unlike any animal I'd seen before, with a bone-chilling mix of human dexterity and animalistic agility. After it left, there was a heavy silence, with only the memory of its clicking sound echoing in my ears. Frozen in place, I tried to process what I'd just seen. When I got back to my senses, I dashed back to my cabin, blind to the myriad of birds I'd initially sought. my heart beat thundering louder than the rustling forest leaves. The familiar sight of the cabin offered me little relief. In the cabin, the encounter replayed in my mind. The park, which I loved, now felt threatened by this menacing presence, filling me with fear. Yet, deep inside, I also felt a spark of odd fascination. Despite being terrified, I was also intrigued by the creature. The remainder of my stay was tinged with a sense of foreboding. The normally harmonious symphony of bird calls was now a sinister soundtrack. The formerly charming thickets, potential hiding spots for that horrifying creature. The crawler had not reappeared, and for that, I was thankful. Leaving the park, I felt a strange mix of relief and a peculiar loss. One thing's for sure, though. My birdwatching trips had gained a new companion, an uninvited one. The dread, the thrill of the wild, the confrontation with the unknown, all dwarfed under the shadow of that menacing creature. It was no bird, but it was undeniably a part of the park's chorus now. Its eerie clicks became a haunting anthem as night fell. A new species indeed, but one I'd hoped to never encounter. But such is nature, at times breathtakingly beautiful, at other times chillingly brutal. I've got to share something that happened to me in Wisconsin, where life is pretty calm most of the time, surrounded by cornfields and cows. But a few months ago, things took an unexpected turn. It all began on a freezing winter night when I heard these strange clicking sounds in my backyard. My first thought was a raccoon or something similar, but this was different, rhythmic, consistent, and unlike any animal I'd ever heard. Not one to let things slide, I decided to investigate. I ordered a trail camera online, one of those weatherproof models with good night vision and high-resolution images, perfect for capturing wildlife or keeping an eye on your property. Setting it up on a nearby oak tree, I hoped it would provide some clarity. I patiently waited, days turning into nights as winter deepened, and the snow blanketed everything. The anticipation gnawed at me, but I resisted the urge to check the footage prematurely. Then, those eerie clicking sounds returned, closer and more unsettling than before. The rhythmic clicks echoed in the silence, like a clock ticking in the night. I could feel the cold biting through my jacket. Late at night, the camera detected movement, breaking the quiet of the snowy yard. What I saw was unsettling. An unusually pale figure, moving in a bizarre, unnatural manner. Its face seemed to stretch into a gaping mouth, with two large, black, ominously gleaming eyes. Donovan, whatever that thing was, it wasn't a raccoon or a kid from the neighborhood. Watching the footage, fear gripped me. I hit pause and studied that still frame, the strange, mismatched limbs against the snowy backdrop. Attached to this email, you'll find the image captured by the trail camera. I can't explain it, but maybe you can make sense of this eerie sighting. My backyard, where I'd spent countless peaceful moments, no longer felt safe. You see, Donovan, this town is my home, and the thought of such a creature nearby filled me with profound terror. But what could I do with this information? I couldn't just call the authorities. I had no concrete evidence, just a blurry image that could easily be dismissed. So I did my best, staying vigilant at night, listening for any signs of disturbance, and treading cautiously in my yard during the day. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and the snow melted, but the clicking sound remained, albeit more subdued. That's when I stumbled upon stories about the crawler, and despite the fear, sharing my experience feels strangely therapeutic. Your friend from Wisconsin. That night in San Diego remains vivid in my memory. Training for a marathon requires an intense level of dedication, and that's what I was in the midst of when this happened. It's not just the physical strain you put yourself through, it's the mental strain too. Whether it was the challenge of endurance or confronting personal struggles, I found myself happily distracted by the intensity. There was something calming about it, the quiet, the solitude. It helped to focus on the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. Each footfall echoed off the park's structures, I often ran through the trail near the Japanese Friendship Garden, with its manicured bushes and hidden koi pond. With each beat, my breath became a low hum, and I could feel my heart pounding from the exertion. I was pushing personal boundaries, making peace with the pain, the fatigue, and the sweat that was liberally streaming down my face. My focus was on the path ahead. The glow of the lamplight in the distance that was shimmering off the wet grass was both my guiding light and my finish line. But this time around, something was off. Things were not looking like they usually did. Something had disturbed me that night, a rustle not far off from the path. At first, I thought it was probably a wild animal, a raccoon maybe. But then an intense smell of sulfur hit me. I stopped dead mid-stride. That is how horrible it was. Even the sweat cooling on my skin didn't smell half as bad. The overpowering mix of sulfur and something undefinable made me choke. Before I knew it, there was a rustling again, but much closer this time. I remember squinting, peering into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. At this point, I couldn't have told you if it was pounding from exertion or from fear. I was no stranger to the park, but something felt wrong. Something felt unnerving. The day had completely changed, and it was now no longer just a run in the park. I remember the freezing dread creeping into me as I spotted an odd shape against the backdrop of the lunar glow. It was huge, standing on two hocked legs, its silhouette unnatural and rigid in the moonlight. My heart continued to pound as I strained to discern the figure in the darkness. I could see the dark outline of monstrous wings, folded eerily against the thing's body, like a twisted take on some mythical beast. Its head was strange, unnatural, straight out of a horror story. The air thickened with tension, and goosebumps formed on my skin. The encounter had just begun. Above the canopy of trees, a figure swooped and dived, snatching bats on the fly. With growing dread, I watched the bizarre scene in the sky. The creature seemed demonic. It was ghastly and terrifying. Its silhouette against the moonlight showed a winged beast, like a dragon with a goat's head. Its skeletal exterior and strange glowing yellow eyes seemed to burn intensely against the pale glow of the stars. It reminded me of goblin tales from my childhood. The sight filled me with primal fear. I was amidst the peace and solitude of the park. But with that grotesque sight in the sky, it seemed like I had walked into a twisted, nightmarish dimension. Yet, I found myself unable to move, paralyzed by a mix of fear and fascination. The peaceful Balboa Park contrasted sharply with the terror in the sky. My once peaceful run now felt like a scene from a Stephen King novel. As the creature completed another terrifying swoop, I snapped back to reality. I could cut my run short or let fear push me faster. Gathering my wits, I chose the latter, my racing thoughts drowned by the pounding of my sneakers on the pavement. As I finished my run, with the park's lamp glow serving as the finish line, my thoughts returned to the graphic sight. What I'd seen began to sink in. The smell of sulfur still steered my senses, and the eerie memory of that unnaturally weird creature loomed large in my thoughts. I had pushed my limits tonight, only it was not as I had planned. I had pushed past what I thought was possible. Would I be able to return to this trail without the image of that beast haunting me? Was I willing to let one run-in with the alleged Jersey Devil derail my training? Time would tell. Right now, the only thing that seemed more dominant than the smell of sulfur was the burning curiosity to find the truth about what I had witnessed. I reached home, feeling an unsettling blend of the surreal and the familiar. I realized my training had taken on a new dimension now. Encountering the Jersey Devil added a thrilling mystery to my otherwise mundane runs. The line between fear and fascination, it seems, is indeed a thin one. I want to share a strange incident that happened in the middle of the summer a few years ago. I was doing this art project in Death Valley National Park in California. Now you might be wondering why anyone would choose Death Valley at the height of summer, but sometimes the extreme conditions there inspire the best art in me. I'd been working on a series of landscapes, trying to capture the unique beauty of the desert, how it comes alive even in the extreme heat. While many see the desert as barren and lifeless, I found beauty in its solitude and resilience. I was deep into the park, camping out near the dunes. I had been there for a handful of days, painting day and night. I was so engrossed in my painting that I lost track of time, often forgetting to eat or sleep. On what must have been the third or fourth day, the desert heat was brutal, even for Death Valley. Couldn't breathe properly, and each swallow of water seemed to evaporate before it went down. But like the time passing by unnoticed, even the discomfort seemed irrelevant compared to my work. But on that particular afternoon, things shifted, and it wasn't just the weather playing tricks on me. I felt watched. Normally, I would have brushed it off as just being alone in the desert and it playing tricks on my mind. But this time, I stopped painting and looked around. There wasn't another soul for miles. I was pretty sure of that. I tried to focus back on my art, but the feeling persisted, growing even more intense. My heartbeat quickened, and despite myself, I was scared. But there was a part of me that wanted to know more. I felt that something unusual was about to happen. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was the heat haze, causing the air to shimmer and play tricks on my vision, a common desert phenomenon. But as I squinted and peered, I realized it was something else. Something in the area was moving against the static backdrop of the sand dunes, barely perceptible, like a smudge against a pristine canvas. At a distance, there were markings in the sand, too intricate to have been caused by the wind. They weren't footprints or tire tracks, but more like symbols, motifs even. That's when I sensed for sure that something was there with me, something bizarre. And for the first time over those past few days, I left my canvas and paints behind and walked towards the peculiarity. The markings in the sand held an eerie feel to them, like hieroglyphs conveying an unspoken message. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I left my camp, heading deeper into the desert to investigate something that I couldn't make sense of. And yet, there I was, feet crunching in the hot sand, heartbeat thrumming in my ears, sweat trickling down my face, walking towards the unknown. As I moved closer, the feelings of dread and curiosity both heightened. In the vast desert, I saw it, or him, or, well, the damn thing wasn't even human. I can tell you that much. It looked to be around 7 feet tall, massive, bulky in its form, with a primal, lumbering grace. Its back was turned towards me, the creature seemingly engrossed in whatever it was drawing in the sand. It was almost as if it was from a movie. The creature was terrifying yet captivating, standing upright with a clear, ancient aura about it. It bore a scaly, reptilian skin that glinted against the harsh sunlight. I could see the large, black claws on its hands, etching intricate symbols into the sand, the power and precision of them strangely mesmerizing. I was too far away to see the eyes, but I could clearly make out the dinosaur-ish, lizard-like head, a terrifying prospect, but at that moment, a fascinating one. While I was initially terrified, I realized the creature wasn't only horrifying. It was strange, but also held a sort of elegance. The creature was focused on its task, not showing any signs of aggression as it kept to its drawings, like an artist deeply immersed in creating a masterpiece. A mix of fear, curiosity, awe, and fascination rendered me breathless. Driven by those emotions, I took several steps forward, each step bringing me closer to that extraordinary entity. But I didn't get too far. Before I'd even halved the distance between us, the creature turned. It looked at me, its eyes a piercing yellow under the desert sun. My heart pounded against my chest like a wild drum. And then, seeming to pay no further mind to me, it turned back to its drawings. Noticing that it didn't plan to harm me, at least not immediately, I probed closer, close enough to make out the intricate patterns it was drawing. They looked like some alien form of art, symbols making sense yet being nonsensical at the same time. I dared not disturb it, fearing it might take offense. So beating back my adrenaline-fueled impulse to run, I stood there watching for a while before retreating, leaving the creature to its work. Returning to my camp, My previous work seemed insignificant compared to the mystery I'd just witnessed. My perspective on life and reality shifted dramatically after that encounter. The encounter with the creature deeply influenced my art and life going forward, introducing a touch of the bizarre and unexplainable to my work. Since that encounter, the world has been a bigger place. The desert, the vast, barren landscape holds more secrets than anyone could fathom. It was cold December that year, and this particular day was heavy coat weather. But I'd finally managed to take some time away to take the solo hiking trip I'd been dreaming of. As an avid winter hiker, I'd long marked Acadia National Park in Maine as a winter destination. To me, winter hiking beat the pain of swatting bugs and sweating like crazy under the hot sun. I craved the crisp air that seemed to sharpen your senses, the profound silence, the crunch of fresh snow, and the beauty of the mountains. It felt like entering a different world. So, I made my way to Acadia. Setting up the camp was easy enough, my tent looking like a tiny little dot in the sea of white. I immediately felt how isolating it was out there. I was alone all right, which I actually loved. The days fell into a rhythmic routine. Each morning I woke at dawn, feeling the cold as I made breakfast. Then I'd head out with the crunching snow under my boots being the only sound breaking the stillness. I lost myself in that cycle for the days following, returning to my tent late each night. I was tired but energized by the day's adventures. It all felt perfectly normal, right until it didn't. It's still pretty fresh in my mind, and I vividly remember how the atmosphere changed in a way that I still struggle to explain. One particular day, I found myself in one of the more forested areas of the park. It was during those moments that I first felt it. I couldn't shake an eerie sense of being watched, and a strange, damp odor of decay hung in the air, clinging to my nostrils and unsettling my stomach, a smell like death. I shrugged it off as nothing initially, but as the glow of the winter sun began to retreat, I felt like I was not alone. I wouldn't say I saw anything, not exactly, but I kept catching unsettling movements in the corner of my eye. My tranquil retreat took on a stifling quality, as if my breaths and the crunch of snow beneath my feet were being muffled. An overwhelming dread started to send constant chills through my body. Then I saw something, what looked like an elk's legs moving in the distance. My heart raced as I strained for a better look, but whatever it was remained elusive, concealed by the forest's edge. It was enough for me to consider packing up my gear and rushing back home, but the small, foolish part of me decided to stay, thinking sleep would shake me out of my madness. As my unease grew, I started noticing other anomalies that seemed unnatural. Random footprints in the snow, eerily tall and disproportionately large, leading into the dense forest that disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. Unidentified howls echoed in the biting air at twilight, starkly different from the usual sounds of the wilderness I was familiar with. I felt like I was being toyed with, stalked. Images kept flashing before my eyes, quick movements at the edge of my sight line in the dimming light, tall shapes that moved with an eerie elegance, strange dark forms in the woods that seemed to oscillate in and out of my vision. The most terrifying moment was an encounter that defied reality. One evening, as the sun set, I found myself closer than ever to the creature, standing just a stone's throw away from it. Antlers protruded from its skull-like head, a gruesome sight against the picturesque winter backdrop. It stood at least 8 feet high, towering over everything nearby. Its eyes, glowing red, seemed to stare right through me, shaking my composure. The creature's appearance was horrifying, emaciated, and barely more than a skeleton. Equally unsettling was the rancid smell, stronger than ever, making it almost unbearably nauseating to breathe. Panicked, I started running, clumsily making my way through the snow to put distance between us. I could hear its haunting groan vibrating in the still air as I made my desperate attempt to get back to camp. I stayed up all night and daylight couldn't come soon enough. As dawn broke, against all odds, I was alive. As I packed up my gear with trembling hands, I found an unsettling respect for the creature, the forest, and the untamed wilderness. That experience has stayed with me, making me more cautious and respectful of nature's hidden aspects. It's a reminder that there's much we don't understand, and sometimes it's better to keep it that way. So, it was the summer of 2015, and I was lucky enough to land a fieldwork assignment at Arches National Park in Utah. I'm a geologist, and I've always been fascinated by unique rock formations. When it comes to that, Utah's a treasure trove. I was thrilled for the opportunity to study these stunning natural sculptures firsthand. My focus was on Delicate Arch, the poster child of Utah. You know the one because its image is everywhere, and you might have even seen this beautiful structure on Utah license plates. Anyway, it was a bright, clear morning, the kind of day that makes those massive structures look like they've been painted against the sky. I was out there in the park, surrounded by breathtaking sights everywhere I looked. The landscape was surreal and captivated me. I had my backpack full of tools and a notebook for all the things I'd find and jot down details of. For the first few hours, everything was as usual. I was happily chipping bits off rocks, collecting samples, jotting stuff down, and taking pictures for later referencing. I was so absorbed in my work that I lost track of time. As the sun began its descent to the west, I was struck by an out-of-place odor, a potent mixture of deep earth, rotting garbage, and sulfur. It wasn't at all common for the area, as anyone who's been in the middle of a desert would know. It's stone and dust, not a garbage dump. Yet it was there, strong and pungent, and I wondered whether some poor animal had died nearby. I quickly forgot about it and moved to another section of the site. However, the bad smell seemed to follow me. Each time I moved locations, it lingered. It was bizarre, unexpected, and unnerving. It felt off. As twilight fell, casting long shadows that distorted the landscape, I knew it was time to end my day's work. But just as I was about to pack up my gear, I heard a soft rustling behind me. Thinking it was a small critter or a bird, I turned around, my gaze falling on a mound of rocks not too far off. The mound was shrouded in the falling dusk. Shadows were adding a layer of ambiguity to its shape. Humoring my curiosity, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the general direction of the noise, squinting to make out the shape. As the flashlight beam danced over the stones, I saw something that looked oddly reflective, almost like shiny metal, something that obviously didn't belong in a mound of earth-toned rocks. I remember freezing in place for a moment. The light beam held steady on that metallic glint. Had someone lost something, or was it left by some careless tourists? The sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, and with the ever-increasing darkness, my instincts warred within me. Part of me was curious enough to investigate, but I was also aware of how late it was getting. That's when I noticed movement, something small and strange, a shadow within the mound. It was barely visible, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. It's hard to put it down in words, that sensation of something being off, of normality taking a sharp left turn. But in that transition from dusk to night, a wave of unease washed over me. I hoped it was just an animal or a trick of the fading light. It was something that was about to turn my quiet evening in the Utah desert into a story that I'd remember forever. I was unaware that this was merely the beginning of my encounter with the inexplicable. I was about to investigate it when a low hum filled the air. It was a deep, pulsating vibration that seemed to resonate from all sides. I barely had time to react when I saw a faint glow hovering above the horizon. It soon flared into a bright light that moved fast and soon ballooned in size, and it now looked like a fireball moving towards me. I instinctively darted behind the largest boulder nearby and peeked out to see the glowing object touch down. It was now a few hundred yards away from where I was hiding. It was a strange disc-like craft, reflecting the scant twilight and making the surrounding bleak desert surreal. But what captured my attention were the decidedly small figures, about 4 feet tall, head and shoulders distinct, that emerged from the bottom of the craft. There were about 7 or 8 of them, with large heads that seemed to bob slightly on their stick-like necks. Their arms were thin, dangling down to their knees. I couldn't help but shudder upon seeing their black oval eyes, devoid of any pupils or iris. I felt an overwhelming sense of strangeness. Their eyes struck me as emotionless, intimidatingly intelligent, and eerily devoid of any discernible features, like a mouth or nose. The smell was stronger now, the putrid scent of rotting things, and the earthy dampness of a deep cave on a humid day. Fumbling in my bag, I pulled out my binoculars. Through the lenses, I watched these figures. My mind struggled to categorize as anything but beings from another world conducting their field research, much as I had been doing moments before. Their spindly digits moved expertly as they went about what appeared to be soil sampling, silent as ghosts, and methodically collected rock and soil samples from all around. I was so awestruck that my heart pounded loud in my ears, while I had completely forgotten about my camera. I felt like I was witnessing a monumental moment. But a thought occurred to me. What if they were territorial? Instinctively, I decided not to further test my luck and kept my camera off. What felt like hours but must have been just under 40 minutes, as my wristwatch told me later. The beings stopped their activities. One by one, they headed back into the craft. As the last one ascended into the dull silver disk, the humming sound returned, and the craft slowly lifted off and vanished into the night. The sudden silence afterwards felt deafening. Once sure they weren't returning, I quickly gathered my gear. I no longer wanted to camp in the desert. Once I calmed down, I sat staring at the horizon, where I had just seen those otherworldly visitors. Days and weeks passed, but I couldn't forget that evening. I felt like someone who'd seen too much, and my thoughts started to mirror conspiracy theories. The emotional turmoil was undeniable. Had I truly encountered alien researchers? Was Earth under extraterrestrial study? I still shiver about it whenever I'm contemplating that thought. So, that was my encounter. As bizarre as it sounds, part of me is hesitant about sharing this story, but people have to know that we might not be alone. I want to share an odd encounter I had a few years back. It was during a mountain biking event I participated in near Park City, Utah. It wasn't a race or anything. There wasn't even a specific path, although a route was marked to help us not get lost. We were just a group of biking fanatics enjoying the mountain. But when opportunity knocks, I often find myself in crazy, chaotic situations, especially on a mountain bike. Because the promise of challenging trails in northern Utah, well, I couldn't resist. The day of the event, we were blessed with clear skies, and the weather was just warm enough for a comfortable ride. On the trail, time seemed to both slow down and speed up simultaneously. The scenery was breathtaking and challenging as usual. I realized about an hour into the ride that I had veered off the marked trail. Rather than panic, I embraced this as a new exploration. I had a vague sense of unease for maybe half a second before the thought evaporated in favor of, well, this just became an exploration. The farther I rode into the unmarked part of the park, the denser the forest around me became. The chirping birds and rustling underbrush kept me company, a welcome solitude from the event's earlier hustle at the starting line. As I pedaled deeper into the unknown, I noticed something peculiar about the environment. The normal sounds of the forest seemed quieter, suffocated under a palpable tension in the air. It felt as if nature was pausing, anticipating something unknown to me. It was then that I heard a strange clicking noise mixed in with the sounds of the forest. Instinctively, I reduced my speed, my grip tightening on the bicycle handles. It was a sharp, disjointed sound that seemed both alien yet familiar at the same time. I couldn't place it, but it didn't fit with the regular in-sync rhythm of the forest. It seemed more personal, more curious. It's hard to describe, but the sound felt curious, and I felt like how a cat reacts to a new noise, trying to understand. To this day, I can't begin to rationalize what followed. There were no screaming alarms in my head, no electrifying feeling of danger. Instead, a subtle unease crept in, as if something unseen lurked nearby. In that eerie silence of the park, I was unprepared for the universe's next curveball. I had stopped and dismounted to relieve myself behind a tree. My mountain bike was propped against a birch tree in a grove. But that wasn't the strange part. It was the creature studying my bicycle with an unusual fascination that caught me off guard. At first glance, my mind tried to place it in any familiar category. Four-legged? Yes. Thin and elongated? Absolutely. It was pale, almost blending with the birch trees if not for its curious eyes fixed on my mountain bike. Its body seemed gone, stretched out and skulking awkwardly on all fours around my bike. I've heard animal noises in the wild, like when canoeing or hiking alone. But the repeating clicks, the organized rhythm emanating from the creature, was altogether unique, if a little unsettling. Its clicking sounded thoughtful, mirrored by the curiosity I could see in its pitch-black eyes as it touched my bike. For some reason, the scene felt more bizarre than terrifying. Was it simply curious about the unfamiliar object that had entered its domain? Was it debating if this hard, shiny contraption was a strange kind of prey? If so, it didn't seem terribly eager to fight it off. Carefully, slowly sidestepping, I maneuvered myself in a less conspicuous spot, still keeping the creature in my line of sight. The creature took no notice, still engrossed in my mountain bike. Gathering my courage, I decided on a slow approach towards the bike, eyes set on it, barely daring to breathe. Inch by painstaking inch, I moved closer until I was just a few feet away. Those black eyes then lifted to meet mine, the clicking sound pausing. Seconds passed like lifetimes, and while it was gone and moved around in a predatory crawl, it didn't feel dangerous in that moment. If anything, it radiated a sense of curiosity. There was a mutual understanding of two foreign creatures, caught in a situation neither would have ever expected. Taking a deep breath, I unclipped the bike, its familiar weight grounding me amidst the strange events. Eyes still locked on the silent creature, I backed away, the tension in the atmosphere finally dissipating. I rode away, leaving the creature in its peaceful habitat. I learned two things that day. First, those mountain biking trail markers were there for a reason. Straying might land you someplace uninvited. Second, we share this planet with far more diverse and awe-inspiring creatures than we could ever believe. The pale, clicking creature became my tale to tell, a testament to the wild and its mysteries. And while it left me a tad more cautious about wandering off during my biking sprees, I can't deny that small part of me that pines for another encounter, another peek into the unseen. I'm writing this to share a peculiar encounter I had while on a retreat in Sedona, Arizona. It happened in late October. I've always been curious about Sedona's spiritual reputation. Curiosity about the metaphysical and a desire for self-discovery drove me to book this trip. My days in the retreat were filled with various activities like guided yoga, chakra balancers, healing stone sessions, and intensive meditation. We were encouraged to connect deeply with the earth. Despite all of us being strangers, there was a strong sense of unity among the attendees, as we were all seeking something profound. During one of our late-night meditations, things took a strange turn. As we gathered outside, the stillness of the desert caught all of us as having a strangeness to it. Meditation began with our guide invoking the spirits of the four cardinal directions. We sat with our eyes closed, focusing on our breath and inviting the energies of the universe to align with ours. It was then that I first felt it, a slight disturbance in the harmony that we were all trying to create, an energy that was off kilter, so to speak. Opening my eyes, I immediately noticed a pair of yellow eyes glowing from the edge of the darkness beyond our fire circle. At first, I thought it might be some local fauna, a coyote or a wild dog maybe. But as the meditation carried on, so did my feeling that we might be in danger. The eyes would disappear and reappear at different spots, as if the creature was pacing the periphery of our gathering, watching us closely. Flashes of something tall and agile moving quickly suggested a form significantly larger than your regular desert wildlife. I noticed a few others cast quick glances towards the darkness, their meditation broken just like mine, faces mirroring my confusion. Next, there was an unsettling sound that we all heard, almost like a whisper, but also sounding like actual words. At the time, I had no idea that this was just the beginning, and the real encounter was still to come. And little did we know that our beliefs were about to be tested. I then noticed a strange phenomenon, an alluring light glowing amidst the darkness of the desert, different than the eyes that I had previously seen. It wasn't part of our retreat. I just knew it for a fact. It felt different, even ominous. But for some reason, I felt compelled to follow it into the desert. So I broke away from the others and started to wander off. This actually didn't alert anyone, because we had been instructed earlier to follow whatever path our minds and bodies felt we should follow. As the light drew me farther away from the retreat, I felt cold, and the whispers became clearer. I tried to blame the desert for my strange feelings, but deep down, an inexplicable dread was rising. I ended up near a towering cactus that looked eerie under the moonlight. That's when I saw a vague silhouette shifting in size, altering in shape. It was an unsteady, blurry image that I had to squint to even see. As I watched, it changed from a coyote to a crow, then an owl, and finally, a human form about 6 feet tall. Against my better judgment, I stood my ground and made eye contact. This thing's eyes glowed a yellow shade and seemed almost hypnotic. The same eyes from earlier. The air around me now felt thick with a musky, earthy scent. Its laughter, it was so human yet laced with a monstrous tone. Taking a step back, I noticed the figure move with an unexpected speed towards me. Panic surged through me, and all the warnings of desert horrors from locals echoed through my mind. I fumbled backward as a realization hit me. Was I face to face with a skinwalker? Banging into the rock formations behind me, I lost my footing and tumbled, letting out a cry that seemed to startle the creature. I scrambled back on my feet and, without taking another look, dashed back towards the retreat, knowing in my gut that I just encountered an entity that the natural realm couldn't fathom. I rushed back to the circle, heart pounding and shaking uncontrollably, but I didn't utter a word about what had just happened. I just explained my shaking by saying I had finally let go of a personal burden I had been carrying around for too long. Truth is, I had actually now added a burden to my life with the knowledge of what I had just seen. When the retreat wrapped up, I left Sedona, having experienced a spiritual awakening of a kind that was completely unexpected. Undeniably, though, this encounter scared me to my core. It also filled me with an odd sense of respect and recognition for these ancient legends many dismiss as mere campfire stories. It showed me how limited our understanding is compared to the vast mysteries around us. I share this profound encounter with you as a reminder to myself and others to keep seeking truths beyond the obvious. A few years back, I took a solo road trip through Arizona during a full moon. I had always wanted to drive across America, just me and my car on the open roads, and the timing of it with the full moon had been purposeful. Part of my trip included traveling through the Coconino National Forest. Now, if you've never heard of it before, it's this immense wilderness in Arizona, known for towering ponderosa pines and sweeping red rock formations that look as though they were carved by ancient forces. The GPS showed a narrow lane diverging from the main road and cutting directly through the forest. Drive on a smooth highway, or swerve through a barely visible dirt path in dense woods in the middle of the night. It wasn't even a competition. Driving through the forest, under the full moon's glow, filtering through pine needles, was mesmerizing. But it was also silent. No crickets, no rustle of the wind. Even my old Chevy seemed to hold its breath. This silence felt different, and my unease quickly grew into dread. And there was this strange smell, a scent I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual mix of pine or spruce, or the fresh mountain smell you might experience in the wilderness. It was more acrid, more pungent, like sulfur. I drove a few extra miles, windows rolled down, listening to Bob Seger play on the radio. trying to ignore the weird feeling creeping up my spine. I was there for the thrill, so I tried to brush it off as the natural unease of being isolated. But then I heard it. The silence was broken by this low growl that seemed to come from everywhere all at once. The growl morphed into a howl that echoed through the silent forest. Before I could make sense of the sound or the situation, there was a sudden heat increase. It felt like I was getting closer to an open bonfire, but that was impossible. There was nothing, absolutely nothing that could cause a fire. Yet the further I drove down the path, the hotter it became. Whatever was going on, I knew then that there was more to that night than I could have ever expected. I wasn't just lost in the woods. It felt like I was losing myself. The bright moon now cast strange shadows that mixed with my car's headlights. Just as the heat was becoming unbearable, so much so that the steering wheel felt scalding to touch, I saw a fiery glow up ahead. It was then that I saw the thing. Crossing my path a few hundred yards ahead, silhouetted by the moonlight, was a beast from a horror film. This wasn't some cinematic illusion. It was real. It was the size of a small horse, but structured like a dog, lean and muscular, with a skeletal form seemingly responsible for those chilling shadows around me. Its hide seemed to fluctuate between matted, dark red fur and patches of what looked like decaying flesh. It was grotesque, and the very sight of it was nauseating. And those eyes, its fiery red eyes seemed to burn intensely. It howled again, and its howl echoed eerily through the forest. The once peaceful night had taken a terrifying turn, and I, of all people, happened to be there to witness it. Then came the chase. The beast howled and two more joined it, appearing from the shadows. In front of me now was a trio of hellhounds, and unfortunately, I seemed to be the prey. Starting my Chevy felt like a gamble, especially with those creatures so close by. They were incredibly fast and kept pace with my car. The searing heat increased with each passing moment. The smell of burning flesh thick in the air. Desperate, with my pedal to the metal, I barreled down that dirt path, hoping the metal of my car would keep them out. Eventually, after what felt like an agonizing eternity, I broke through the edge of the forest, entering an open clearing. The temperature immediately dropped, and the unbearable stench faded. Looking in my rearview mirror, the fiery eyes of the hellhounds receded back into the darkness of the forest. Overwhelmed, I pulled over to catch my breath, my hands trembling on the wheel. The night grew silent again, but a comforting warmth washed over me. It was relief, true relief, that I had escaped what could have been my doom. Looking back, all alone under that big, bright moon, was I truly lost in that forest, or did I stumble upon something beyond understanding? Either way, I think I'll stick to the highways in my future trips. After all, I know my story sounds unreal, and I might have doubted someone else's story like this. But those fiery eyes in the darkness of the woods, and that chilling howl, they were real, as real it gets. Every road trip I take now, every detour I see brings me back to this. And there you have it, the mystery I encountered in the quiet woods of the Coconino National Forest. Savannah has always fascinated me. It's one of the oldest cities in Georgia. The place is steeped in history, and history always comes with its own stories, which I love. That's why I was there one weekend back in 2019, visiting a buddy of mine. His name's Marty. We got to talking about these haunted tales people like to tell. Stories of local hauntings have always been prevalent here. I was skeptical at first, but thought it could be a fun way to spend a Saturday night. So there we were, signed up for a ghost tour that covered a good bit of the historic district. Those old colonial houses and grand squares are a sight to see, even if you don't believe in ghosts. But at nighttime, with just the lampposts and the tour guide's flashlight for illumination, it's an entirely different ballgame. The soft street lamp glow gave the city an eerie feel, with shadows seeming to lurk around every corner. Our guide was a big, burly guy with the deepest voice I ever heard. He was incredibly knowledgeable, and his way of storytelling was genuinely spine-chilling. We started off around Monterey Square, the famous Mercer House looming ahead. The guide took us down shady lanes, narrating heartbreaking tales of lost loves, vengeful spirits, and mysterious disappearances. Each house we passed was seemingly more haunted than the last. Despite my skepticism, I was deeply engrossed in the stories, each one evoking a mix of melancholy and intrigue. Marty was cracking jokes for the first half, but I could see him growing quieter as the tour went on. I suppose the tales can affect even the most skeptical among us. We visited a couple of places on the list: the Colonial Cemetery, the Sorrelweed House, the Eerie Hanging Square, each with a tale more chilling than the last. By then, even I felt uneasy, attributing it to the power of suggestion and our surroundings. About an hour and a half into the tour, we entered Calhoun Square. Now, Calhoun is known as Savannah's most haunted square. There's an anonymous burial ground at its center, and it's surrounded by some of the city's most notorious haunted houses. Our guide shared that people often report feeling cold spots, see strange lights, and hear whispers in and around the square after dark. We moved on, and I couldn't help but notice a peculiar chill in the air that hadn't been there before. It was undeniably eerie. We then stood before a particularly dilapidated house. As the guide started on his next narrative, I felt a tug at my jacket sleeve. Figuring it was Marty, I turned around to tell him to quit it, but he was on my other side, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. Blinking back confusion, I glanced down and saw the dull glint of an antique-looking locket at my feet. As I bent down to pick it up, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I instantly knew it wasn't Marty or anyone else from our group. The touch was too cold, almost unnaturally so, and it made me shiver and gasp. Everybody turned their gaze towards me, including Marty and the guide. Their eyes locked onto something behind me. I turned around and came face to face with a woman, or rather, the figure of one. It was a translucent figure with a kind of otherworldly glow about her, looking profoundly sad. I heard whispers all around me, and panic started to set in with the group. Shockingly, there were chains wrapped around her wrist, with matted black hair reaching up to her shoulders. The whispering around me grew more insistent, and among the murmurs, I caught a name: Amelia. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back. The figure just stared at me for a moment longer, before disappearing into the night air. The hand on my shoulder disappeared with it. With a dry mouth, I forced myself to swallow and looked up at our tour guide. His face was a shade paler than before, and his eyes wide. A prickling sensation swept over me in the chilly air, a response I couldn't control. After a few gulps of cold Savannah air, I found my composure and held the locket up to the guide's lantern. Inside was a faded sketch of a young woman. Underneath the face was a single word, barely visible but still legible: Amelia. The rest of the tour passed quickly, everything blurring together as I could barely concentrate. And I think the guide just wanted to distract us. Marty, pale and quiet, tried to lighten the atmosphere with a few forced jokes, but even he felt the shift in our surroundings. The rest of the night passed with an unspoken agreement to not discuss the earlier events. I spent that night researching Amelia, and what I found was incredibly unsettling. A young woman named Amelia, reported missing in 1886, was one of Savannah's most haunting stories. Her disappearance had remained a mystery, and some believe that she still roams the city. Holding the locket now, it was becoming less a mystery for me and more of a first-hand encounter. Savannah, it turned out, still carried its past around in more ways than meets the eye. I questioned my own skeptic notions, questioned what I knew, or rather what I didn't know. In my hand was a piece of Savannah's eerie history, a direct link to stories between this world and whatever might lie beyond. It happened a few summers ago, and I believe it was in late July. My buddies and I were music junkies, and we had our sights set on this offbeat festival right in the heart of Joshua Tree National Park, California. Joshua Tree National Park is known for its rugged desert landscape and distinctive trees. An odd place to hold a music festival, but it gave it that unique touch. The atmosphere was isolated, really out there, unlike our lives back home. It attracted music enthusiasts, artists, and adventurers like us, looking for something different. Our group was buzzing with excitement before setting off. It was our first ever desert trip, and the idea of a music festival under the sky sounded awesome. Our expectations were more than met. The music, the people, the place. It all fell into this perfect blend of celebration and escape. When we arrived, the festival was in full swing, with the vibrant beat of music from various stages filling the air. Musicians from all over filled the space. Between performances, we explored. Craggy rock formations stood alongside the iconic Joshua trees against the vast desert backdrop. During the day, the place baked under the sun, but when the evening came, it cooled down and you could just sit and gaze at the sky filled with countless stars. It felt like a different world. After an amazing performance by a band that had split up 2 years ago, but reunited just for this, we lay on our backs watching the stars. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but all we did was lay there, admiring the crystal clear sky and bright constellations. A gentle breeze stirred the desert sand and rustled through the sparse desert plants. And closing my eyes, I soaked in the calmness, thinking, this is it. And then the tranquility was interrupted. At first, it was nothing but a sensation, an inexplicable shiver of excitement, that prickling sensation running through our skin. We looked at each other, silence hanging. Each of us waited for someone to break the uneasy spell and mention what we were all feeling. But before any of us could say a thing, something in the night sky caught our attention. Just as we were sharing glances, an odd light show began to play in the sky above the festival grounds. At first, I thought the festival organizers were putting on a drone display, or maybe a satellite was passing by. But these lights were moving in a way that had me second-guessing. Above us, several lights in an arched line stood out with their silver glow against the dark sky. They pulsated softly, casting an odd, almost metallic sheen. They weren't big, probably the size of a car or a small truck, but their sheer presence was undeniably overwhelming. And they moved, not erratically, but gracefully. Swooping across the sky, they floated and bobbed where an aircraft wouldn't, falling and rising gently, as if teasing the laws of physics. We were stunned into silence, yet we couldn't look away. The sight of those UFOs, their surreal glow, their dance against the backdrop of the moonlit night was mesmerizing. The festival grounds went quiet, everyone's attention captured by the bizarre scene above us. For a few moments, it felt as if time had stopped. The music, the laughter, the clattering of beer cans all blended into a distant hum, almost drowned out by the hum, a mechanical, almost ethereal sound coming from the lights in the sky. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the show in the sky ended. One by one, the lights dimmed and then winked out. But unlike stars, these lights didn't blaze out. They faded gently, leaving us to wonder what had just happened. In the days to follow, we pored over what we saw countless times amongst ourselves and with others who had shared the spectacle. Some dismissed us as just drunk revelers, but we were sober enough to know what we saw. It was real, and it was out there. That night left us each with a sense of profound fascination and a touch of fear, to be honest. It sparked 1,000 questions in our minds. Are we alone in this universe? If not, who are our celestial neighbors? Ultimately, that experience overshadowed everything else, becoming the unforgettable highlight of our summer. Now, when we talk about that night, it's not with fear, but with a sense of wonder and perhaps a bit of hope. That night's encounter with the unknown left a mark on us. I believe we're all quietly hoping to see those lights again, to experience that mix of awe and curiosity. Who knows? Perhaps one day, those same lights will return, and when they do, we'll be ready. I've always explored nature on my own, so when I packed up my SUV and headed out in the middle of July to unearth the secrets of the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, it was nothing unusual for me. It was a sunny day with blue skies, and the sunlight made the sand glisten. With every step, warm sand enveloped my shoes, and the vast dunes seemed endless, reminiscent of a golden sea. I've always been drawn to wild places, and the towering sand dunes held a certain mystery for me. Although I was well acquainted with nature, I was unfamiliar with anything supernatural. After walking for several miles, I stopped at a moderate slope to take in the awe-inspiring views. A smattering of yucca plants peeked out of the dunes further away, and the sight of them amidst the vast sands was humbling. The rest of the world seemed distant, drowned out by incessant gusts of wind carrying tiny specks of sand. I was captivated by the solitude of the place. Minutes turned into hours, and soon the blazing sun started to set. I sat down watching it set. Just as I was doing so, a sudden uneasiness crept into me, breaking my reverie. Realizing how deserted the venturing site was, I suddenly felt uneasy. It was then my eyes caught something unusual. Far beyond a distant dune, I noticed a rapid movement skirting the ridges of the sand dunes. It was too far to discern, but for a fleeting second I imagined I saw a form, a silhouette both familiar and foreign at the same time. It had a human-like stature, but moved with an agility that was far from usual. It vanished before I could take a better look, leaving behind an unsettling feeling. The once calming winds now felt ominous, and the sand beneath my feet seemed uneasy. As darkness gradually crept in, casting long and weird shadows across the dunes, my anxiety heightened. I shook my head, dismissing the eerie feeling, and decided to call it a day. The day had turned to a tense evening, and I realized it was getting late. Little did I know, the real encounter was yet to come. As I headed back to my SUV, parked a couple of miles away, I started hearing sounds that I couldn't quite place. It began with a soft rustling, then came a low, eerie whisper that seemed to carry through the wind directly towards me. It was more troubling because, somehow, the whispers began to sound familiar, almost like they were repeating my own voice. Just a few hours earlier, I was talking to myself, excited about the exploration. Now, those whispers seemed to repeat what I said earlier, like a delayed echo. Growing increasingly worried, my pace quickened. The whispers grew louder, less indistinct now. Adventurous streak, untouched treasures, beautiful sand dunes. My own words played back to me in an uncanny echo. The voice sounded human, but the following laughter didn't. It was chilling and inhuman. Suddenly, a shape appeared on a dune next to me, almost hidden in the dark. The figure had an unnatural quality to it, appearing human-like one moment, only to shift into a monstrous animal-like shape in the blink of an eye. I squinted, trying to see its details, but its form was too inconsistent and scary. Exploring, I heard again, clear as day, my own voice. The unseen voice's laughter pierced the stillness again, sending a chill running down my spine. I tried to think logically. Maybe the wind was causing the echoes, but it felt like a nightmare come to life. Its size, the way it moved, and how it transformed ignited a deep fear in me. An indescribable dread overwhelmed me, and I knew I couldn't stick around to sate my curiosity about its true form. I couldn't understand what I had seen. It was beyond anything I knew. With my heart racing, I ran back to my SUV. Once in the safety of my SUV, I struggled to process the night's events. Over the following days, the fear turned into an obsessive need for answers. I found myself talking to locals, sharing snippets of my experience, and asking them about any legends or rumors they knew about. An elderly local told me about skinwalkers, beings from local lore said to mimic voices. It explained the eerie occurrences at the dunes. Though I found some peace in the explanation, no amount of intellectual understanding could drown the recurring nightmares, or the chill I would feel every time I remembered those echoed whispers. My memory of the great sand dunes changed. Its beauty was now overshadowed by that eerie experience. The dunes were no longer about adventure for me. They reminded me of that disturbing, unexplained encounter. I'm an amateur nature photographer, and the rivers of West Virginia are a dream location for good photos. What fascinates me most there is being able to clearly see and witness wildlife in their natural habitat. So, I planned a river trip during the long Memorial Day weekend last year to get my fill of West Virginia. I headed to the Canaan Valley and eventually launched off from a small clearing in the valley that promised me the best vantage point for the longest stretch on the river. And it goes without saying that I was sure to have my camera and binoculars close at hand. It was a clear morning, with the river reflecting the sky. Navigating the river's soft bends and floating on smooth water most of the time, the hours passed peacefully. I spotted a variety of birds including kingfishers, herons, and astonishingly, a bald eagle. Each camera click brought me more joy than was normal. I was deeply engrossed in observing everything, and little did I know, the normality of the day was about to change drastically. As I continued to drift down the river, I noticed a sudden lack of birds in the sky. Not only was their physical presence gone, but the once vocal birds had gone mysteriously silent. That was my first indication that something was off. And not just off, but strange even. It was an eerie quiet, a stark contrast to the previous hours. Before long, I found myself floating through a thicker part of the forest. The sudden shade from the thick, overhanging branches offered a respite from the sun. It was there that I first felt watched, scrutinized from the shadows. I was convinced that there was an undefined presence lurking just beyond my vision. Despite the sense of foreboding, adventure has taught me a lot about the unknown, that it can be both daunting and delightful. And discovering nature's mysteries, even the frightening ones, is part of the thrill for me. So, I pushed past my fears and continued forward, eager to see what lay ahead. It wasn't long before my unease grew into a chilling sensation, and a looming presence lingered around me. Fear was creeping in. I rounded a bend in the river, where the forest drew close, giving the river a confined, tunnel-like feel. The stillness was still incredibly unnerving. As I reached for my camera to try and bring a sense of normalcy, I couldn't help but look behind me. Turning, I saw something on the riverbank that I struggled to make sense of. It stood there in the shadows, roughly the size of a man, but alarmingly different. The creature was winged and covered in a strange layer that I can only liken to feathers, only they weren't exactly feathers, but more so like the wings of a bat, smooth and black with an almost slick sheen. The creature's fiery red eyes contrasted its shadowy silhouette. The rest of its features remained elusive, almost as though they were shrouded by an unseen force. All I could hear was a thudding that was echoing in my ears. I fumbled for my camera, but something deep within me snapped. Those eyes were not inviting. They oozed an air of hostility that I wasn't about to challenge. In a flurry of panic, I paddled as if my life depended on it, the water around me flailing in all directions as I attempted to move away. All the while, I felt those eyes on me, an intense gaze that I swear could have burned a hole through concrete. As I rounded another bend in the river, the creature was now out of sight, but its presence lingered like a nightmare. I paddled furiously, needing to put distance between me and that creature. Back at my camp, I found no solace at all in the familiarity of my things or the warm fire. The creature, with its dark wings and tormenting eyes, haunted my thoughts. Honestly, the encounter deeply affected me. How could it not? Every shadow moving in my peripheral vision took on an ominous undertone. I woke up still filled with an eerie dread. I paddled out of there as soon as the dawn was bright enough to guide my way. My camera and binoculars, which once brought joy, now felt like heavy reminders of my encounter, since there were what had brought me here. I traveled for miles, praying not to see that figure standing on the banks again. I do wonder now if I remember everything the way it actually happened, and if it was real, was it the creature from local lore that I had heard of when researching the area? You know the one I mean, the Mothman. Will I ever know exactly what it was? I doubt it. Though one thing's clear, my river adventures, they'll never be the same. With this, I end my tale, still grappling with the reality of the encounter. It might sound like fiction, but this chilling experience was all too real. I promise you that. I'm a long-haul trucker, been at it for over 15 years. I've traveled all over the U.S., But this story is from when I started driving to Alaska. It was November or thereabouts, during the onset of winter. Nome, Alaska, the farthest point on my route, is a small town where everyone knows each other due to the isolation. Because of the isolation, long haulers were a novelty, so I got a decent welcome when I visited. I had hit the road pretty early from Anchorage that day. It was past midnight when I reached Nome after a long drive through snow and freezing temperatures. I was exhausted, and my truck needed refueling. I always preferred driving at night. Fewer cars on the road and some quiet time to think. The downside was that most places shut down after a certain hour. So, spotting Goldie's Diner brightly lit along the main road was a welcome sight. A cold breeze hit me as I stepped out, the distinct smell of diesel in the frosty air. The place was nowhere special, an old prefab structure, more a relic than a functional diner. Round chrome-edged counter, plastic-top tables, and chairs bolted to the floor. It looked untouched since the 50s. The menu was simple, really strong coffee, burgers, fries, and pie. The owner, Goldie, was an elderly Inuit woman. Her earrings jangled when she talked, and she had a very blunt view about truckers. "We feed them, fuel them, and send them off," she used to say. As she refilled my cup, she pointed to a sign on the wall that mentioned a possible motel around back. I decided to try my luck. I was too tired to sleep in my cab, and the prospect of a hot shower was too great a temptation. After a Herculean burger and a half-hearted promise of a room later, I stepped outside for a smoke. The sudden drop in temperature was so intense, it took my breath away. The moonlight reflected off the snow, and I remember it feeling spooky. Everything was so quiet, so still. The night shift hadn't kicked in yet. There was nothing but the low growl of the diesel generator, the crunch of my boots on the snow, and the breeze. As I flicked the butt of my smoke into a snowbank and killed the lights of my truck, something else filled the air. The air turned damp and carried an unpleasant odor. I recognized it instantly. The smell of roadkill, rotting flesh that somehow managed to make its way to my nose despite the freezing temperatures. The truck's parking lights cast long shadows among the trees. I stood there, looking out at the landscape, all the while wondering if Alaska held secrets that no one knew. I've seen some crazy animals in my time, from mountain lions in Nevada to bears, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what happened to me next. Everything went quiet. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw diner patrons freeze, their eyes wide with terror. Yet, they said nothing, not a word. All I heard was an eerie scratching noise, like huge elk moving through the woods, but it was accompanied by a grotesque, rhythmic chewing sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand. The stench intensified, causing me to gag. It was rotten, like spoiled meat left out in the sun. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere, creeping up and crawling all over me. I squinted into the darkness, unable to ignore the strong smell. Then, illuminated by the diner's neon glow, I saw the creature, a grotesque fusion of man and deer. It had the legs of an elk, but the torso and arms of a man. It was impossibly tall, dwarfing me at over 8 feet. And its face. Oh God, its face was a horrendous deer skull. Empty sockets glowed with an unnatural yellow light, and it sported antlers that towered over its skeletal dome. A crazy crown on this monstrosity. It let out a chilling screech that I'll never forget. Fear gripped me. I turned on my heel and sprinted towards the diner entrance, hoping to God or whoever was listening that the thing wouldn't catch up. The bolt on the door snapped shut, and I stood panting, back to the door, heart pounding in my chest. On the other side of the door, I could hear a deep growl echoed through the glass, and the most hellish screams filled the air. It was a sound of anger, of frustration. It was a sound I've never heard before. The locals didn't speak, but the fear in their eyes said everything. They had heard it through the glass when I was outside with it. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I headed for the hotel and paid for a night there since I did not want to be in my rig, with only a windshield for protection. Lying in bed, I listened to the wind, the scratching of the trees against other trees, and the occasional distant thump. Every noise was threatening, Every sound made me think it was a potential attack. That was my first, and God, I hope, my last encounter with what I think was a Wendigo. I knew because I heard the locals whispering that word. I left at dawn, leaving Nome behind as quickly as possible. Now I avoid driving at night. Its silence and darkness weigh heavily on me, because I know what secrets are out there, what monsters hide in the dark. And trust me, when they come out, you can't escape the terror they throw at you. This happened to me while I was out hiking in Acadia National Park in Maine. This was a few years back, around mid-June. The weather can be unpredictable this time of year. Cold mornings turn to warm afternoons, only to get cold again by night. Still, I wouldn't miss it. It's the best time to see sunrises when they're dramatic and colorful. Maine was always my inspiration. So, I set out before the crack of dawn one day, packing my camera and hiking gear. I aimed for Cadillac Mountain, the first place in the entire U.S. to see the sunrise, hoping to get great sunrise shots. A park ranger directed me up the Northridge Trail, saying it'd be less crowded than some other spots. He was a sturdy man with a Santa-like beard and wise, aged eyes. So, I hopped onto the trail he pointed me towards and started my climb. The start of the hike was almost surreal. The darkness began to lift as the forest came to life. The air was crisp with the scent of earth, pine, and sea. I heard the rustle of leaves, occasional birds, and waking forest animals. I found an ideal spot just as dawn was starting, with rugged cliffs covered in morning fog. I unpacked my camera, set up my tripod, and began taking in the sights through the viewfinder. Just as the first rays of warm sun started, something odd happened. The birds stopped singing. The incessant hum of insects was abruptly cut off, and even the rustling leaves fell silent. Though my senses have dulled with age, I detected an unusual odor, earthy and musky, but there was this underlying scent that I can't quite put my finger on. It was strange, like the scent of decay or rot. I shrugged it off as some animal done its wild animal business nearby. But then I heard it. It was distinctly human, yet also not. And despite the outside temperature slowly warming up, a chill enveloped my body. Sure, spooky tales are easy to put in your brain, but something honestly didn't feel right. I'm not one to get scared easily, but this unnerved me. I felt like prey, realizing I was not alone. Next, I saw something reflect off the face of my camera's viewfinder. I turned around, and who do I see but the very same burly park ranger from earlier? But something wasn't right. He wasn't the cheery-faced, helpful fellow I'd met earlier. His face was now sunken, gaunt, almost as if years had passed. His eyes flickered. He was still in his ranger getup, green and gray, but the clothes hung on him, seeming out of place on his suddenly emaciated figure. The eyes, though, those gave me the shivers. They were human-like, yes, but lacked any emotion at all, like they were dead. He just stood there staring at me. I tried to meet his gaze. I tried to ask what was wrong, but the question caught in my throat, coming out as a dry wheeze. That's when it happened. The wind howled, whipping around me like a frenzied beast, and he released a chilling, guttural laugh that echoed through the silence. The laugh seemed to come from everywhere. It was a high, cold, mocking laugh, not like the man I'd met earlier. Then he, or it, or whatever the hell it was, began whispering, and it sounded like me. The words turned into a mumbled drone, allowing me a moment to gather my racing thoughts. I figured I had one option at this point to get out alive, and so I ran, slipping and falling, yet scrambling up, my fight or flight response revving into overdrive. Despite my love for those woods, I've never felt such relief as when I saw the car park. I jumped into my truck, slammed the gas, and didn't let up till I saw civilization. Meanwhile, those rangers' haunting eyes imprinted in my memory. And the photographs I clicked that day, I erased them. Meanwhile, all they were images of the forest and the sunrise. But I didn't want any reminders of that godforsaken morning. Because here's the thing, I couldn't chase off this one unnerving stray thought. Does Mother Nature really house these twisted and evil beings? I was never religious, but since that day, I say a quiet prayer before entering any forest. Hunters and campers speak of strange encounters with creatures they call skinwalkers. And since that day, I believe every word they say. If you ever decide to enter a park, please just keep your wits about you. This story took place back in the summer of 2018, when I was living in North Carolina. The day was perfect. Clear skies, the sun was shining, and there was a slight breeze. I decided to drive to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. A beautiful, peaceful place despite being an alligator refuge. I thought it would be a perfect drive. Many people are wary about visiting such places alone, but at that time, I was actually looking for time alone to reset myself. Anyway, this seemed like a pleasant escape from my daily life. Well, at least it started out like that. With a name like Alligator River, you'd have certain expectations. Trust me, the place is not all swamp and marshland. It's a vast woodland with scattered water bodies. There's a strange harmony in the landscape that adds to its enticing appeal. As I drove more into the heart of the refuge, away from the sounds of civilization, tranquility set in. The sounds of nature was all like a symphony of the wild. Anyway, about an hour into my drive, my truck jolted. It was subtle, but I felt it. I pulled over to the side of the road. To my dismay, my front right tire had gone flat, like completely flat. Just when I thought things were going smoothly, a part of me was frustrated. Part of me tried to shrug it off as another adventure. So there I was in the middle of my day, fixing a flat tire on a sunny afternoon. The spare and jack were in the back, under all my camping gear, the tent, sleeping bag, and a bucket of random little tackle equipment. The gear was heavier than it looked. As frustration set in more and more, I tried to keep things light, chuckling at thoughts like how this could be my ultimate survival test if I was ever on that TV show Survivor. Finally, after a long while of getting organized, I was finally ready to fix the tire. The silence around me was obvious. In hindsight, it was the calm before the storm. I was bent down, working on the lug nuts when an uneasy feeling set in. It was like I could feel someone approaching me from the back. But looking around, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to convince myself that the silence was playing tricks on my mind. I mean, who wouldn't in such a situation? But eventually, the silence really started to get to me. I could almost hear my heart beating, scratch that, thumping in the quiet. Crouched down there, I started feeling even more vulnerable. The tranquility I had been enjoying so much was starting to turn ominous. Let's just say I didn't feel alone down there anymore. Suddenly, there was a scuffling noise in the bushes. My heart raced. I looked around, scanning the area, but there was nothing. My grip on the tire iron tightened involuntarily. I've encountered many wild creatures before, but nothing prepared me for what came next. As I turned back to work on the tire, a sudden clicking noise echoed near me, a sound I couldn't place. It was unnatural, almost like scuttling and clicking something simultaneously. I got on my feet, my gaze darting around in every direction. My heart pounded in my chest as I swept my flashlight into the trees where the light didn't quite reach. The beam fell on a patch of ground about 30 feet from my truck. A flash of white went scattering. I squinted to see, and that's when it caught my eye. A pale figure, about 7 feet long, skittering and glitching like something out of a horror movie, moving away with a speed and grace no normal human could achieve. I only caught a glance before it disappeared into the thick underbrush, but its grotesque form was seared into my memory. Nearly human, it was extremely gaunt and covered in a colorless, tightly pulled skin with an unnatural stance. The face, if I can call it that, was just a pit of darkness with glistening black eyes and an open, gaping mouth. All thoughts of fixing the flat tire were gone. I grabbed the necessities, abandoning the rest, and jumped into my Bronco. Starting the engine felt like an eternity, the creature's clicking echoing in the silence. My shaking hands finally turned the ignition, and the engine's roar was a welcome sound. I floored it, gravel flying as the working tires caught traction. I just knew I had to get out of there even though it might run my car driving so fast on a flat. As I left, a weird sensation lingered around me, but I didn't dare to look back to see if it was following me. The rest of my drive was a blur of panic and fear, every shadow screaming danger. We all think we're brave until we're tested. I can tell you that for sure. As the engine roared along the trail, every mile put between that ungodly creature and me felt like a little victory, especially driving a car that wasn't 100%. Driven by a mix of shock and curiosity, I felt the need to share my experience, hoping someone might recognize the creature I'd encountered and be able to tell me what it was. So, I stopped at the nearest lunch spot and sat down at the counter. I told the waitress about the gaunt, white crawler-like creature. She looked nervous and just said I was lucky to have gotten away, almost brushing me off, but I felt she knew more than she was saying. I'm still not sure what I encountered that day. What I am sure of, though, is that there are some places man just shouldn't go, and some mysteries are better left unexplored. As for me, I will never return to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. I still can't explain what happened that day at Mount Rainier National Park. This was last summer, mid-July, up at Mount Rainier in Washington State. I've always loved escaping to the mountains. I woke up early that day, around 5 a.m., and drove up to the park. I parked my car and started off along the Skyline Trail. That morning, there seemed to be fewer hikers around, and I was excited to have the trails largely to myself. The air was crisp, the sky clear blue, showcasing Rainier's majesty. The cool mountain breeze whistled gently around me. For 2 hours, I hiked alone, immersed in my hike. At a higher elevation, the silence was broken by a strange scraping noise. It was harsh and grating, a mechanical sound that was totally out of place in nature. I stopped, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. And then, out of nowhere, goosebumps spread across my skin and my heart raced. I never felt such unease in the vast open wilderness before. Something was off. I slowly turned around, my boots crunching against the loose bits of earth and rocks beneath me. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows of the tree line, about 100 yards behind me. After a while, squinting my eyes at it, it just sort of vanished into the landscape. I couldn't make out more than a silhouette, large and looming, bizarrely mismatched against the forest. Fear gripped me then, an animal-like instinct overriding my rational thoughts. It didn't make any sense. Animals, even the large ones, didn't merely stand and watch. They either approached or fled. As much as I tried to shake off the strange encounter and carry on with the hike, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Although my imagination can be wild, this felt real. The figure felt intelligent and cunning. I scanned the surrounding areas but found nothing out of ordinary. Just the occasional rustling of leaves and the odd bird fluttering out from the canopy. The weather seemed to shift in response to my unease. Clouds rolled in, casting an ominous shadow over the trail ahead. I decided to call it a day right there. The enjoyment of my hike was now overshadowed by a growing unease. I turned back, heading towards where I had left my car, picking up my pace a little, trying not to let the fear get the best of me. But that didn't shake off the feeling. I felt like something was out there watching. Occasionally, a rustling or distant scrape would break the stillness. I quickened my pace, trying not to run out of fear of triggering a predatory response. I kept telling myself it's just an animal, maybe a bear or a stray elk. But deep down, I felt this was different from my usual hikes. Though I couldn't pinpoint what it was, one thing was clear. I felt pursued by something unnatural. Eventually, I made it back to the meadow where I'd spotted the first oddities. Boulders dotted the area. One such large rock, normally a favorite for the local sun-loving animals, caught my attention. On it, surprisingly, was a human figure with their back turned towards me, seeming to bask in the sun. This figure was blending somehow both oddly and perfectly within the setting of the wilderness. Gathering my courage, I walked closer to it. What I assumed to be a hiker or a camper sitting on the rock was neither. As I came closer, it slowly turned to face me. Its face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a half-man, half-reptile thing. It then stood on two legs but had these gigantic black claws extending from what would have been human-like hands. Its eyes were glowing yellow, holding an intelligence that made me instantly realize I was not the top dog here. Its head resembled that of a dinosaur or lizard, with large, sharp teeth. The reptilian watched me, its yellow eyes fixed unblinkingly on me. I felt like prey. Somehow, I regained control of my legs, took a step back in fear, and instantly the creature moved closer. Now standing at its full height, I could see that it was at least twice my height. As my mind screamed at me, the creature just turned around, literally jumped off the rock and disappeared into the deep forest. For minutes I stood there, my brain numb with shock, my hands shaking and heart pounding. The fear I still harbor from that day returns every time I think of the woods. When I got home, I struggled to accept what I'd seen. I wanted to dismiss it completely, but it was impossible. I knew it was real. I was convinced that what I had seen was not of this world. It's been months, and not a day goes by when I don't think about what happened on the Skyline Trail. Basically, in a nutshell, I believe I encountered a mythical reptilian humanoid. Life, for me, has forever changed.